The Iranian Ambassador to Australia, Ahmad Sadeghi, has labelled Israel's retaliatory strike on Iran as a terrorist attack coming from the lawless Zionist enemy. This is despite multiple warnings from the Australian government over his public comments. Joining me live is Liberal Senator and former Ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. Good to see you, Dave. Thanks for coming on the program. So, what should be done about the Iranian Ambassador? If anything, he doesn't seem to be listening to the government.
No, he's not listening to the government. I mean, certainly he should be called in for his remarks, because clearly this response by Israel was to 180 ballistic missiles that Iran fired at Israel some weeks ago, and Israel's response was targeted, it was justified, it was proportionate, it was directed solely at military targets. Israel has a clear right to self-defence. But look, the Iranian ambassador here seems to be hell-bent on stirring up trouble and making a name for himself domestically. That's not the role of ambassadors. Ambassadors are meant to be the private channels and conduits for communication between governments. They're not meant to involve themselves in domestic politics. And I think it's well past time that the Australian government asks Iran to send them someone else to represent their interests here in Australia.
Egypt's president announced yesterday his country has proposed a 2-day ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, during which 4 hostages held in Gaza would be freed, along with a number of Palestinian prisoners. Do you think that Israel should agree to that?
Well, I think Israel should agree to whatever is necessary to get back their hostages consistent with their security interests. And this has been the barrier all along. I mean, the previous negotiations with Hamas broke down largely because of Yahya Sinwar's intransigence. He was prepared to release some of the hostages, but was not necessarily prepared to release all of them, and then wanted Israel to cease all its operations against Hamas. Now, I think something like the Egyptians are proposing, a temporary cessation of hostilities to allow the return of some hostages, Israel would welcome. There are talks underway in Qatar today and tomorrow, Australian time, to facilitate that. But I would just caution that, we've been close to deals in the past here. It's unclear what Hamas's ability is to deliver on these commitments, given that they don't seem to have a new leadership. And these sorts of talks have broken down frequently in the past.
Just while I have you, your reaction to the election result in Queensland over the weekend, and in particular, do you think that the poor showing by the Greens comes down to the minor party's stance on the Middle East that's turning off voters?
Well, I do want to congratulate David Crisafulli and the LNP team for a very strong result in Queensland. And look, I was heartened to see the loss in Greens support. And I think what it shows is, look, their embrace of extremist and radical causes, not the least of which is supporting terrorist organisations like Hamas and Hezbollah, is alienating mainstream Australian voters who might be attracted to parts of the Greens' environmental policy but do not want this sort of radical activism that they've seen played out on the streets. You know, Greens joining anti-Israel, oftentimes anti-Semitic protests in Australia. I think that's putting off a lot of people, as it should. I mean, these values and morals have no place in Australia, and I'm glad to see they're paying an electoral price for that.
What lessons are to be learned ahead of the federal election next year, do you think?
Well, look, I think, firstly, if you've got a competitive, united opposition that is putting forward alternative policies, all of which David Crisafulli had, then the electorate is quite up for a change. And I think we've seen electorates become more volatile in recent years. And whilst we would have previously in the past said it's unusual for a first-term government to lose office, well, that is true historically, but I think the electorate's shown itself to be willing to embrace a change. And I think our job as a federal opposition is to continue to hold the Labor government to account for poor decisions, poor economic management, poor national security management, and present a credible alternative, as we are doing on home affordability and housing, as we are doing on energy reliability and affordability, as we are doing on budget and fiscal strategy. And I think if we do that, the electorate will, be prepared to trust us, show their trust in us and potentially deliver us office. I hope that's the case.
Dave Sharma, good to chat to you. Thank you for coming on the program.